Now that we have our animations set up, let's go in and create a class that can manage switching between the two with code. In our scripts folder, let's create a new C# script, and we're going to call this Player Animation Manager. Let's open this up and start adding some properties in order to help manage our animator. The first thing we're going to want to do is get a reference to the animator instance itself. Here, we'll make a private property that's typed to the animator and call it animator. Next, we'll also need a reference to the input state. We're not going to be using our start method, so let's delete it and create an awake method. Inside of this, we'll get a reference to the animator by looking for the component on the game object. And next, we'll need a reference to the input state. Now, we always want to assume that the player is running. So we're going to set up a variable called running and set this to true. This is basically the default state of the player, is to always be running. But there are a few scenarios where the player obviously isn't going to be running. One of these scenarios is if the player is being dragged off of the screen and he's not in the air at the same time. In this case, let's create a condition looking at the input state's absolute value, x, to see if it's greater than 0, and we'll look to see if the input state's absolute value, y, is less than the input state's threshold. Now, if this is the case, we can assume that the player is not running. So let's change running back to false. And finally, what we're going to want to do is change the animator to set its Boolean of the running flag that we created to equal running. Now, let's save our script and go back over to our player and add this to the player game object. Now, let's open up the Game tab and run our game. When the player jumps, you'll see he's still running while he jumps. If he lands on something, however, you'll see that he stops. Let's try this one more time and just make sure everything is working. Here we can jump over objects and look like we're still running. Now when we get stuck by an object, you'll see we get pushed off the screen and the player stopped running. Now while this is a very simple class, it's an important one to have. Just like I was talking about breaking out the state of the player into the input state, the jump behavior and the jump logic into its own class, now we have a player animation manager that separates out our view logic. In essence, we have a very simple model view controller that's taking care of making our player move and animate correctly. The input state represents a basic model that you can query at any time to know what's going on with the player. The jump represents a controller, and the player animation manager represents our view. The next thing we'll do is allow the player to be recycled, so when he falls off the screen, he'll just be disabled, and we'll be able to reuse him when we want to restart our game.